I've seen Neil deGrasse in those short clips sometimes on social media.
So when you say, do you believe in God, is it which God? Is it Zeus? Is it Poseidon? Is it the Jewish God? Is it the Christian God?
And in doing so, they try to put everything together and say, these are all made up things that people come up with in different ages and cultures, and they don't amount to anything. There is still a fundamental difference between the God of the Bible, if we understand what he is and how he relates to us, and all other gods in all our religions. As a way of introduction, I want to tell you a story. When I started high school back in communist Romania a few decades ago, the way they organized classes in public schools, and there were only public schools, you couldn't go to a church school like we are privileged to have here, was that each class had a school advisor. One of the teachers were assigned to be in charge of that classroom and all the students in it. We were about 32 of us. And their responsibility, of course, was to keep order, to deal with whatever problems may arise. And more importantly, for the authorities at the time, they were responsible with the Marxist-Leninist indoctrination of the classroom. And at one of the first meetings we had with her, she was also a physics professor, she gave us a questionnaire that had about a dozen questions on it. And I was naive enough to think that it was some sort of small print, like when you start something and they have you sign on whatever. So I didn't pay much attention. I think I answered yes to everything and I just gave it. Next time she came to class, she entered from the side. Her desk was here, entrance was somewhere in there. She barely entered the room. She had this big class roster with all our names and grades and all that. She threw that on the desk. And then she proceeded to yell my name. And she said, "How dare you bring such a reproach on the honor, on the name of the Communist Party?" And I was like, what's going on? What did I do? I had no clue. And everybody was 31 eyes or looking at me like, whoa, what just happened here? We didn't know each other much. We just started high school. And then she said one more thing. She said, on that questionnaire that we did last time, this student was brazen enough to claim that his father is a member of the Communist Party. His father's profession is incompatible with his quality. And that's all she said. And then imagine in recess how I felt, and for a while after that. You see, my father was a Seventh-day Adventist preacher. And as a religious person, you could not be a member of the Communist Party. And that incident, among others, that was one of the more dramatic that I still remember from those years, created a situation where I felt very different. And you probably did too at times. Because for one thing, being religious in that environment made you different and stand out in a bad way for the authorities. But even within the Christian majority, we as Seventh-day Adventists are making sometimes a bit of a discordant note. We are different in some important ways. We worship on a different day. On the seventh day, it's part of our name, it's part of our identity. So we have all these unique beliefs, and I had to deal with this idea. How important are these after all for me? Do I want to keep getting in these uncomfortable situations? Are they worth it, basically? And so for one level or another, I think we all have to ask this question. And as we read, and John read at the beginning here, we have this important advice from Peter, who says, be ready to give a defense to anybody who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. And that Greek word there, apologia, stands for basically a properly well-reasoned reply, a thought-out response to adequately address the issues that are being raised. And I'm not don't think that I'm trying to criticize here, but I am a little bit surprised that our teaching institutions that form preachers and pastors, we don't, as far as I know in this country, we don't have an apologetics department. And I think that's an opportunity to grow. as a church. Others do. And one of our founders and counselors that we all, I think, respect, Ellen White, she makes a statement. She said, let the truths that are the foundation of our faith be kept before the people being us, being the church. And this is actually a copy, a screenshot rather, of the actual journal number, May 25, 1905, where she wrote this article. And she proceeds to say, some will leave the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. They talk science, and the enemy comes in and gives them an abundance of science. But it is not the science of salvation. I think that's very relevant today because we live in a world where science is positioned as being the opposite of belief, of Christian religion in many ways. You almost have to choose either or. And so I found this insight very interesting. She said, the devil can give you an abundance of science. You see, science is a tool. You can use it for whatever you want to study. It doesn't take sides, so to speak, spiritually speaking, if you want to look at it that way. But I think she was referring more to scientism, to the idea that some people choose to limit their seeking to the material domain only. And there's nothing beyond that. And they end up worshiping that reality, not in a literal sense, but as a worldview. So I think that's what she's referring here. We are not against science as a church. In fact, one of the distinctive characteristics of Seventh-day Adventism from the beginning is our rational, intelligent, logical study of Bible truth. We want to understand. We think it makes sense. We think God, as a rational, intelligent being, gave inspiration to Bible writers so we can make sense of it, and it's not some mystical, beyond logic reality. And then she ends up this paragraph saying, we are now to understand what the pillars of our faith are and the truth that made us the people that we are. The question that I have for you, what are the pillars of Adventism? If we were to list them just in one word or one sentence, what would you say? What comes to your mind first? And feel free to raise your hand and say it. What's one of them? So the Sabbath is one, second coming. And one easy mnemonic to remember, 5 of them start or can start with the letter S. Sabbath, second coming, there's 2, there's 3 more. State of the death is the third one. Sola Scriptura could be one of them. Yes, I like that. Although it's not necessarily very specific to Adventism, but we embrace it very much so. But others could identify with that. And with some of the others, second coming is not an exclusively Adventist belief, but we really emphasize it. What else? Sanctuary, yes, very important and quite unique in that sense. It's probably one of the most unique Adventist teachings in today's Christianity. So we have 4 of them. How about another the 5th with S, starting with S? I quoted Ellen White. We look at her Spirit of prophecy, that's a very distinct Adventist belief, right? I have 4 of the S's here. There is 2 more that I thought about. And you can make a list. I chose to make a list of 7 to make it nice and, but you could extend it or expand it however you want. Anything else that makes us unique or different? Yes, the health message. You don't see that a whole, although it's making its way. I worked a couple of years in Utah after I finished residency, and I was pleasantly impressed to have discussions with doctors there who were Latter-day Saints or Mormons, and they were very proud of their lifestyle and the impact on their longevity and quality of life, including avoiding coffee. They were quite insistent on that. And anything else? So you health reform, is there anything else that comes to mind? What gives us as a church our identity? What is the biblical passage that we go back and say, this is our mission, this is our statement of what we need to do? 3 angels' message, very distinct, unique Adventist. These are the other 3 that that you guys, you guessed them all. See how good you know these things? It's very good. I'm impressed. Our church from the very beginning did not subscribe to creeds. That's another somewhat unique Adventist feature. Most branches of Christianity, all the way from 1700 years ago, the Council of Nicaea, they found it necessary, important to establish an official creed that they recite, that they embrace, that they defend, sometimes even violently. We, from the beginning, have said we don't have an official creed. We have distinctive beliefs. We have fundamental beliefs. We have a whole book about that. Well, we don't have a creed. But there is a reason why and our founders framed this concept, because we have what we call the present truth concept. Meaning, while there are fundamental concepts in Christianity, how are we saved? The value of what Jesus did for us on Calvary, and many other fundamental beliefs that are unchangeable and they're foundational. For each Christian or Christian community in any age, in any time in history, there is a specific, very relevant truth that can guide them in that moment. Think about it this way. I was trying to come with an illustration. I think the best I can come up with is you go to visit your parents and you drive and you haven't gone on that route, let's say, before. And you are using GPS. And the thing it's telling you, it's funny, first time when my father, I wasn't there, but my sister told me, my father never drove a car. So he was with my sister and GPS just made its way into Romania. So they were going to have an eye check or something, I believe. And the GPS was telling, take a left and, at the next, roundabout, do this and that. So after a while, and he was saying it in Romanian. So after a while, my dad asked my sister, said, what is this lady knowing where we're going? In his mind, it was a real person doing the thing. It's like a GPS in the sense that we know the destination, we know where we start, we are in the car. But as we go to a specific place where we don't know exactly where to go and what turn to make, the present truth that we study, we embrace, we understand, sheds light in that moment for us to know where to go, what to do, and what turn to take. So in that sense, there is a progression that our church has gone through as a movement from its very beginning and even before in the Millerite movement, and then the Second Great Advent. And after that, in 1863, the church was organized. And here we are today in 2025, where we are sitting after 162 years since the church was officially founded, or trying to find our identity and what the GPS is telling. What's the present truth for us today? That's the question, right? And in that sense, I think it's much more relevant to have this concept of present truth live in our mind and not try to freeze our understanding to a rigid creed that somebody in 325 or whenever established. Not that we despise that. It's sometimes claimed, for example, that Isaac Newton may have been an anti-Trinitarian. But in fact, it turns out that his understanding of the Trinity was such that he did not feel comfortable with the wording of the Council of Nicaea that used the word substance, same substance. He found it problematic to define divinity as a substance. So for that reason, he thought, I'm not buying this. Anyways, that's a tangent. All right, so for the next few minutes, if you bear with me, I'll need your help again, because I want to challenge you to help me provide answers that are biblical to these most common arguments against the Sabbath, because we're going to focus on the Sabbath primarily. It's a short time we have together. We cannot hope to address all 7 or however many distinct pillars of faith we have as a church. So let's focus on the Sabbath and let's look at the most common objections or arguments against the 7-day Sabbath and see how we do and how we understand them. Is that okay? All right. And the challenge that I have for you is I want you to think, you don't have to give me the chapter and the verse and the book, but just the idea Think of a Bible passage that contains the words of Jesus that explains or provides an answer to that challenge. Is that okay? All right, let's do that. The first challenge, most common, oldest perhaps. Jesus viewed the Sabbath as part of the old covenant. You have the old covenant, he comes, he's the sacrifice, he opens this new covenant. The old goes with the old, here comes the new, and the new Sabbath, as a celebration of his resurrection, is what we celebrate now as Christianity. I've heard this from Greek Orthodox people. Catholics sometimes make the same thing, not as much. Catholics have a distinct, they are more open and honest about it actually than most. But a lot of evangelicals would come with this understanding, and sincerely so. So how do we respond to this? I've heard some evangelical preachers saying, Jesus never explicitly endorses the 7-day Sabbath commandment. In the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about do not kill and expands the meaning, right? Do not commit adultery, expands the meaning. They never explicitly said, hey, here's how we do what we do about the Sabbath. And in not doing that, they claim, he prepared the way for them later to embrace the new Sabbath under the new covenant. So how do we respond that with the words of Jesus, if possible? I will start with this. It's not the exact words of Jesus, but it talks about what Jesus did in Luke 4. And it says that as his custom was, when he go to Nazareth, his hometown, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. So his custom, whenever Sabbath would come, he wasn't out there establishing a new covenant. He was going to the synagogue like any devout Jew of his day would be expected to behave. And so in doing that, I think at a minimum, we can establish that he embraced the custom of worshiping on Sabbath. Is that fair to say? More than that, like you just mentioned there, in the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't explicitly say, hey, here's how we keep the Sabbath, but he said this, do not think that I have come to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Till heaven and earth pass away, one jot on one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Here's another claim. Jesus viewed the Sabbath as a temporary Jewish cultural tradition. I think John MacArthur and others in evangelical circles make this claim often.
God was designing a peculiar people. No matter how the other nations did it, the Jews did it different. No matter how they dressed, the Jews dressed differently. No matter what they ate, the Jews ate differently. No matter how they prepared the food, the Jews did it differently. They had all kinds of laws with regard to Sabbath, ceremony, worship, all that isolated them. The design of God was to isolate the community for its own holiness, separation. And God was protecting the people to protect their future so that the Messiah would come from Abraham through the line of David, that would still be in existence.
How do we reply to that? Thank you. I really like that. And I haven't included that here, but I think it's very important. So what you are saying is that if the Sabbath will be relevant in the new world, after all this is done and finished, how can we claim it was just a Jewish custom, right? The other end of that story is also true. I think you're going there, perhaps. The Sabbath was given at creation to all humanity, long before there was any Jew. So whether you go back in time to the origin, like we just did, whether you go in the future, we see the Sabbath there and playing a prominent role on both ends. So it's a very feeble argument to say that it was just a Jewish custom. I think this argument works, and I'm not criticizing, but this is the reality. This type of argument works for people who are really not familiar with the Bible. And I chose a slightly different route here from the history. I'm glad that you brought the beginning and the end. I was expecting that you will do so, and I commend you for that. I wanted to also cover the time in between. And that is this text here, Matthew 12. Matthew 12 is a great chapter for the Sabbath. Haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple, they desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than that temple is here. And that's the punchline. So what Jesus is saying here, if we study this argument carefully, he's saying, look, if you, as very orthodox Sabbath-keeping Pharisees and Jewish leaders of the first century, are willing to make an exception for the priests who serve on the Sabbath. And in fact, if you remember from the regulations on how to perform the sacrifices on the Sabbath, they would have to do double duties. There would be 2 lambs sacrificed on Sabbath instead of 1 on the other days. So if anything, they did more work if you looked at the mechanics of what they did on the Sabbath. And yet Jesus says, if you are willing to give them a pass and say, listen, because they serve an important purpose in the temple, they are not guilty while they do work, you should be even more willing to give me and my disciples a pass, because the work that we are doing in bringing salvation, in fulfilling all these priests did all these centuries as a type of what I am going to do for humanity here, you should have absolutely no problem giving us a pass in this respect. Does that make sense? So in that sense, Jesus claims divine authority over the Sabbath. And earlier on, some of you made mention to one of the texts when he explicitly says so. And it says the Sabbath was made for man, not for just the Jews, not the man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Again, claiming divine authority over the Sabbath. And this is also a very powerful argument, I think. Because if you think about it, what ruler, even on this earth, claims authority over something and claims it as important as its own only to destroy it? And here's another one. Jesus broke the Sabbath when he intentionally healed the sick or sick people on the Sabbath. How do we respond to this? Because it seems like if you read a lot of the healing miracles Jesus performed, he actually intentionally went out on the Sabbath and performed them. So Cinder, tell me. There is indeed, and I think I actually have that right here, Cinder. But which of you having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on the Sabbath day will not immediately pull him out? That's the right thing to do, right? You don't let any creature die just because, it's Sabbath, we don't do that today, right? And then in Mark 2:27, I think he was in a synagogue here when he made this statement. It says, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? What Jesus is doing here, he's not destroying the Sabbath as the religious leaders or the Jews was accusing him. He's simply restoring the right way to observe the Sabbath. Do you agree with me? Yeah. This is what he's doing here. He's not saying, because he could have said, listen, people, we are at the end of this old covenant right here. It was a perfect opportunity to bring light and start a new way to do this thing. We don't find any of that kind in those statements of Jesus. Now here, I think it's an important moment to stop and make something clear, because when we talk about the right way to observe Sabbath or to do anything that God asks us to do in his 10 commandments and in his requirements for us, I think it's very important to have this understanding, and that is God values the service of love. He's not interested in some transaction with us. If you do that, I'll do this. Or if you give me that, I'll give you this. That is a primitive, I dare to say almost pagan way to look at our relationship with divinity. It's one of the fundamental differences between true Christianity and all other religions. You see these people, I've seen Neil deGrasse in those short clips sometimes on social media.
So when you say, do you believe in God, which God? Is it Zeus? Is it Poseidon? Is it the Jewish God? Is it the Christian God?
And in doing so, they try to put everything together and say, these are all made up things that people come up with in different ages and cultures, and they don't amount to anything. There is still a fundamental difference between the God of the Bible if we understand what he is and how he relates to us and all other gods in all our religions. And that difference has to do with this. All other gods have to be appeased. They expect some transaction from you. The God of the Bible transacted himself for us. And he expects a service of love, and he provides the choice. You can take it or leave it. It's not forced. So in that sense, the observance of Sabbath is very important for us to understand that it has to be a venue that brings men and women in communion with God. Anything else or short of that, if we get ourselves bogged down in wearisome rites, the object of Sabbath is thwarted and it's a mere outward observance and it's a mockery. So this is super important to keep in mind when we have this discussion and how we actually process our understanding of God's law on the Sabbath. Here's the last one, and the most perhaps difficult to answer, although it's not that hard. And this one comes across like this. Of course, all this is true. Jesus was a Jew. He followed the custom of Jews while he was alive. He wanted to show respect for what God provided for the Old Testament people. But again, we have a new covenant now. So not endorsing explicitly the Sabbath means that he basically honored it before, but after his resurrection, he left room, he left the door open for his followers to bring something better. How do we answer this one? And to help you with this is what I'm saying here is easy, I think, to prove from the words of Jesus that the Sabbath was important, that he was the Lord of Sabbath, that he wanted to fix how they were observing the Sabbath, all the way up to his death. But do we have a statement of Jesus that refers to the Sabbath beyond crucifixion in some way or another? I see some hands. I'm wondering if anybody else that hasn't answered would be willing to volunteer an answer. Think about, did Jesus, and this actually directly contradicts the statement that Jesus never specifically endorses the Sabbath. Again, it's an argument that works in the context of ignorance, of people who don't carefully read the Bible and listen to what it says. I know you guys know the text, I'm just going to show it here. In Matthew 24, the famous chapter where Jesus talks about the signs of the end, what to expect in the future. There is an important statement in the context of the future destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. The Romans destroyed it. So that was about almost 40 years after the crucifixion. Jesus tells his disciples and those alive at that time for the future, he says, pray that your flight from the city away from that destruction, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. So I think this is a very clear, unambiguous statement from the mouth of Jesus himself that shows that he expected his followers to observe the Sabbath. He expected the Sabbath to be meaningful for his followers well beyond the moment of crucifixion and resurrection. You agree with me? Okay. Thank you. Here we are in a modern society, orders of magnitude more complex, more intricate than the first century Jewish world at that time, or even the Roman world. So the idea is that as Christians, we should contextualize our message to the modern world. We should be sensitive to what the needs of the people are. And I think that is all true and very important. But with that, sometimes we hear this statement that the Sabbath idea is antiquated. It's not relevant. It's difficult, for one thing. You know, we live in a fast-paced society. And related to that, there is this idea that as Christians, God accepts and sometimes even expects from us to be creative. You probably heard people say that it's important to respect the Sabbath. But if you decide to do it on a Wednesday, God will accept that. You know, God is a God of love. He's flexible. He's going to embrace whatever you dedicate to him, right? Or if it's on a Sunday, why not? Like everybody else in Christianity, except for a few small exceptions here and there. Why wouldn't God accept that? So how do we reply to this one? It seems like these things matter to God. God is a stickler for details. if you want to put it that way, for some reason. We may not like it, but he seems to be a stickler for details. But there is a reason for that. It's not because God wants to be arbitrary or unreasonable, although this argument is being made. I remember there was a time a few years ago where I had a long correspondence with one of my relatives who was buying into evolution. So one of their counter-arguments was, look, this story in Genesis must be a myth, because why would God set such a childish test? Don't eat from the fruit. I mean, come on, what's wrong with eating a fruit? You know, it's a fruit. You know, you are a vegetarian, they were saying. Right? So is God unreasonable? Is he setting up arbitrary rules just to trap us? Is that what's happening there? So I'm going to make the case in the next 5 minutes, if you give them to me, where I try to prove the opposite, okay? And answer indirectly the argument against the Sabbath along those same lines. If we look at the forbidden tree story, it was relevant, if you think about it. They were in a garden surrounded by fruit trees. They ate from those things every single day. So what was the most relevant thing if God wanted to set a test? To choose a tree, right? We could think about it this way. If the Garden of Eden would be here and there would be a huge parking lot with all makes of cars in the world, and God would come and say, hey, you guys can drive every car you want when you go to work every morning, except this Tesla. This Tesla is the car of knowledge of... I'm just kidding here. I don't have anything about Tesla. They are great cars, okay? But what I'm trying to say with this silly illustration is, it was very relevant. That's what they were doing. They were tending the garden. They were dealing with these trees all the time and the fruit. So it was very relevant. Was it specific enough? Of course, yes. This tree, it was hard to miss. It wasn't like evasive or diffuse or hard to understand. It was very simple, very clear, very specific. Was it imposing an undue hardship on them? Not at all. It was one tree out of many. They weren't going to starve if they went for that tree, right? Ultimately, the main reason that this test was put together is because it was a test of trust. Its purpose was for them to acknowledge that God was the creator and they were the creature. And the obedience was an expression of that understanding and trust. And the disobedience would be the opposite, right? Same thing we can say about the Sabbath. Is it relevant? Of course it is. We live our lives in time, dominated by a weekly cycle. We go to work, we have weekends. We get paid, we measure our life in weeks. So it's very relevant. And that's true for everybody on all the cultures around the world. It's not like we have 1 week, and except for short periods in history where other weekly cycles have been tried and failed, it's the 7-week cycle that's been around ever since we can count and remember. Is it specific enough? Of course, sunset to sunset works for every culture in every place, whether they have fancy clocks or they are just shepherds looking at when the sun sets over the hill, right? It works for everybody everywhere. Is it generous? I mean, we have a ratio of 6:1, right? We have 6 days for ourselves and 1 for God. So I think it's pretty generous. And even that 1 day, it's really for our benefit in this crazy world, isn't it? You know, I'm happy I'm here and not at work today. Is it a test of trust? For sure. I mean, if you observe the Sabbath, you acknowledge God as the creator, just like they did when they observed the tree. He is the owner. And in fact, I didn't touch on this, but there is a very beautiful theological study about the 4th commandment as being the only commandment among the 10 that provides or gives us the sign of who's in charge there, because it's the only commandment that gives the territory, jurisdiction, but also the title. Because in ancient times, these things were typically in a seal. You had the name of the person, you had their title, and you had their jurisdiction. So if you read the 4th commandment, go home and read that and try to find these 3 things. They are very clearly set there, and they are not, at least all 3 together in a clear format, in any other commandment. So if you take the 4th out, it's kind of missing the point. The rest of it could be easily interpreted as some regulation that anybody could perhaps put together in some way or another. So I'm going to end here by saying that the Sabbath does not open heaven's gates, in the sense that by observing the Sabbath, we don't get credits to make it to heaven or earn our way to heaven. But remember what Ellen White said about the service of love earlier. It reveals the relationship, if we observe it, and that's the right way to observe it. It should be an expression, a manifestation of the relationship that we already have with God. That's that redemptive relationship. We couldn't do other than keep the Sabbath in that context. So I started with a story, and I'll end with a story. And I tend to tell stories from my life, not because I'm narcissistic, but they speak the most to me. So when I was at the end of medical school back in Romania in 94, it was a time of change. Communism was gone just for a few years, and everybody was trying to figure out how to do things, how to bring things up to par, and so forth. So when we finished 6 years of medical school, they had us sit for an exam that would look back at all the 6 years and everything we learned, almost like a board exam, you would think today here. And the exam, we started for a few weeks, and then when the date was announced, I realized it was on a Sabbath. Now, as a little background, when I was younger and I went to school from 1st to 12th grade, most of it was done during communism. In fact, all of it. And communists had a policy that involved going to school 6 days a week, and you only had Sunday free. So if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you had the choice to either go to school on Sabbath or not go to school on Sabbath. And they managed to drive a wedge in our leadership as a church there, in the sense that some decided, parents, not to give their children to go to school on Sabbath and face reprisals and persecution and all kinds of difficulties because of that, depending on the local situation, how much understanding or lack thereof they could find, versus other parents who decided, you know what, this is a good thing, they are learning, they are becoming educated, it's a good thing, let's allow them to go to Sabbath. My parents belonged to this last category, so I went to school on Sabbath for most of my formative years. My wife belonged to the other category. She didn't go to school on Sabbath. And we weren't fighting with each other over these things in the church. I don't recall anybody really having a huge argument over this. But for me personally, seeing other colleagues of mine who took a stand where I didn't, it made me uncomfortable. So as I matured in my spiritual understanding, communism was over, the 5-work-day week came. So in medical school, I didn't have a problem with Sabbath because it was free. But there's this exam at the very end. And on that exam, passing that depended you getting an MD diploma. If you didn't sit for that exam, you wouldn't get that. So it was probably a couple of weeks or less ahead of time when they settled on the date. So I decided to go and talk to the dean of the school to see if there's any chance they could change this. Now, you have to understand that I am by nature a very timid person, or I used to be at least at that time. I didn't have an assertive personality by any means. So it was very difficult for me to take that decision and then to go and talk to him. And what made it even worse is I knew this person because he taught classes through medical school, and I knew him to be a very staunch, militant atheist, an evolutionist and anti-religion guy. So I knew that I wouldn't speak to a sympathetic person or ear at all. Anyways, I mustered the courage, I prayed about it, and I said, this is what I need to do. So I went in an audience to his office, and I said, listen, here's my situation, and I'm not going to be able to come and take this exam, and I kindly ask you if you could make allowance for me to take it on another day or find some way to make it possible for me to graduate. So he looked at me. I could see where internally he was kind of boiling and trying to, like, what's wrong with this guy? I was like, why are you making my life difficult with such a stupid thing in his eyes? But he didn't say anything super nasty. He just said, you realize if you don't come that you're not going to be a doctor. And I said, I know that. And he said, well, I don't think we can do this. It's already published. It's on the boards. And then he said something to the effect of, what about the other Greek Orthodox students that are your colleagues? There are many more of them, and they keep Sunday. So if we change it on a Sunday, what do we do then? I said, I'm not saying that you need to change it on a Sunday. There's other days in the week. Anyways, we had a bit of it was clear he wasn't very happy to. And I went out of that meeting with the impression that I'm not going to be able to sit for that exam. And then I think it was a weekend or something like that, 2-3 days. And I just happened to pass by. I was already making other plans and things and how to reinvent myself. And I was walking through the entrance of med school where they announced all these little things on that glass bulletin board. And my vision was caught by a new announcement that was in big font. It said, attention graduates, the exam, however they call it, date has been changed to a Sunday. And I was like in disbelief. I was like, am I seeing things? Anyways, long story short, I was able to sit for that exam, and I graduated, and I made it to eventually become a doctor. What I'm trying to say with this story is God is a stickler for details in a good way, because these things serve as a way to strengthen our faith, our relationship with Him. Because in moments like this, you see God working. You see Him real. It's not just something you read in the Bible or in some book. It becomes part of your identity. This is a core memory for me. I will not forget this as long as I live. And everybody has their road in life and their challenges. You know, you may have even a different understanding about that particular situation, and that's fine. It was my road, my understanding, my experience in life. So I hope that speaks to you in a good way. Anyways, I think as we close this, we have to remember that the Sabbath is a divine appointment, really, and it's not just a rule, it's not just an arbitrary regulation, it's a weekly appointment with our Creator, and I hope that you will be willing to keep it. God bless you.